Kaelen Marlowe was once seen as a quiet, reclusive father, but now he's the center of a nationwide manhunt. His wife Alira is dead, his daughter Mira was dragged into the wilderness, and police believe he's hiding in the vast, unforgiving forests of Idaho, with survivalist skills, a paranoid mind, and nothing left to lose. Kaelen has become more than a fugitive. He's a ticking time bomb dot in the peaceful mountain town of Claridge, Oregon. Spring had just arrived. The snow was melting, birds had returned, and neighbors were beginning to step outside after a long winter. It was the kind of town where everything felt predictable. But when the Marlowe family disappeared without a trace, it sent shockwaves through the quiet community. Kaelen Marlowe had always been considered a bit strange by the locals. Tall, with sharp eyes and a rigid posture, he didn't talk much, but he wasn't unfriendly either. He lived with his wife, Alira, and their 8-year-old daughter, Mira, in a modest wood frame house tucked near the edge of town, right where the dense forest began. Kaelen worked as a carpenter, taking odd jobs around Claridge, while Alira was a part-time librarian known for her kindness and calm demeanor. Mira was often seen riding her bike up and down the cul-de-sac, always under the watchful eye of her mother. The disappearance wasn't noticed right away. In small towns, people come and go without much fuss, especially families who enjoy solitude. But by the end of the second week of April, a few neighbors began to sense something wasn't right. Alira hadn't shown up for her Saturday shift at the library. Mira hadn't been at school, and her teacher had received no phone call or message. Even stranger, packages had been piling up on the Marlowe porch, untouched for days. Concerned, a neighbor called the local sheriff's office for a wellness check. When deputies arrived, they found the front door unlocked. Inside, the house was eerily still. There were no signs of a struggle. The living room was tidy, and the kitchen table was set with plates from what looked like an unfinished breakfast. A glass of orange juice sat untouched next to a half-eaten bowl of cereal. Alira's purse was on the counter, and Mira's backpack was still hanging by the door. The only thing missing was Kaelen's truck, an old forest green pickup that neighbors often saw him working on in the driveway. His tools were gone too. And a quick search of the garage revealed something even more puzzling: a large laminated topographic map pinned to the wall. Sections of national forest land across Oregon, Washington, and Idaho were marked in red ink, but one specific region deep in the Idaho Panhandle was circled in thick black marker. The sheriff's office filed a missing persons report for all 3 members of the family and began combing through their digital lives. Alira's social media had been dormant for nearly 2 weeks. Kaelen's accounts had been inactive for months. They had no recent credit card transactions, no cell phone activity, and no outgoing communication. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. When extended family members were contacted, the responses were mixed. Alira's sister Vela was immediately alarmed. She had received a strange email from Alira 10 days earlier that simply said, "If something happens, look in the blue box." She hadn't understood it at the time and dismissed it as a mistake. Now it felt ominous. The search began with local hiking trails and nearby forests, but quickly expanded when it became clear Kaelen may have had an escape plan. Officers discovered that just 3 days before the family vanished, Kaelen had visited an outdoor equipment store and purchased over $2,000 worth of survival gear: thermal blankets, non-perishable food, a hunting knife, and water purification tablets. He had also emptied the family's joint savings account. What started as a missing persons case was beginning to look like something far more complex. Investigators now feared that Kaelen had taken his family into the wilderness deliberately. But if that were true, why was Alira's purse and Mira's backpack still at home? And why was there no note, no message, nothing to explain their sudden disappearance? Claridge had never seen anything like this before. Rumors spread quickly through the town. Some believed the family had met with an accident while hiking. Others whispered about Kaelen's strange past, his obsession with survivalism and his long periods of isolation in the woods years ago. As search teams prepared to expand their efforts beyond state lines, one thing became chillingly clear. This was not just a disappearance. It was the beginning of something far darker. As days passed with no sign of Alira or Mira, the investigation intensified. Detectives turned their focus to Kaelen Marlowe, whose quiet nature was no longer seen as harmless, but rather unsettling. His history began to take shape through interviews, records, and scattered reports. Before settling in Clay Ridge, Kaelen had spent nearly 6 years living off-grid across several states: Montana, Idaho, Utah, places known for their remoteness and unforgiving landscapes. He had no criminal record, but his name had appeared in a 2013 welfare check report in Montana after hikers reported a man camping with a small child in freezing temperatures. The case had gone nowhere, but now it felt like a missing piece of a larger puzzle. Investigators learned that Kaelen had joined a number of online forums dedicated to survivalism, anti-government rhetoric, and doomsday preparation. Though inactive for years, his past comments revealed a deeply paranoid worldview. He believed modern society was crumbling, and those who weren't prepared to live without it would suffer. He often spoke of cleansing the mind and returning to pre-structure living, phrases that at the time had seemed like nothing more than eccentric ramblings. Now they carried an ominous weight. A break in the case came when a forestry worker in eastern Washington spotted a vehicle matching the description of Kaelen's green pickup truck heading east on a logging road near the Idaho border. The witness didn't know the truck was tied to a missing persons case until news broke days later. By the time local authorities searched the area, the vehicle was gone. Still, it was the first credible sighting since the family's disappearance. Then, the discovery no one expected. In a wooded area about 60 miles northeast of Clay Ridge, a body was found buried in a shallow grave near a stream. It was discovered by a group of fishermen who noticed a foul odor and disturbed earth. Forensics confirmed what everyone feared. It was Alira Marlowe. The autopsy revealed blunt force trauma to the head and multiple defensive wounds. There was no sign of Mira. Her absence raised terrifying questions. Was she alive? Or had she too been killed and hidden somewhere else? The tone of the investigation shifted completely. Kaelen was no longer a missing person. He was now a murder suspect and the presumed abductor of his daughter. A warrant was issued, and his face was plastered across national news. The FBI joined the search, adding Kaelen to their list of most wanted fugitives. With his history, knowledge of wilderness survival, and deliberate planning, authorities feared he could stay hidden for months, maybe even years. The public was warned that Kaelen was likely armed and dangerous. Outdoor enthusiasts across the Northwest were urged to report any sightings of unusual campsites, abandoned shelters, or a man traveling with a young girl. The tension was rising. Reports began flooding in, dozens of tips, many unreliable, some seemingly desperate. But one call stood out. A solo hiker near Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, claimed he had seen a man with a child walking through dense woods. The man looked unkempt, wearing mismatched clothing and carrying a large canvas bag. The child appeared dirty, tired, and barefoot. Though they didn't speak, the hiker sensed something was wrong. When shown a picture of Kaelen, he immediately said it was him. A sketch was made from the description, and it closely resembled Kaelen and Mira. Authorities descended on the area. Helicopters flew overhead, and search dogs were deployed. Rangers blocked off entry points to the national forest while teams combed through trails and abandoned hunting cabins. Still, no one was found. But searchers discovered traces that confirmed they were on the right path: a discarded protein bar wrapper, a footprint matching a child's shoe size, and a torn strip of flannel with a faint blood stain. The urgency escalated. Kaelen was moving, and he was likely surviving on deep knowledge of the terrain. The forest was his territory, not theirs. The fear now wasn't just about finding Mira, it was about what Kaelen might do if he realized how close law enforcement was getting. The deeper investigators looked into Kaelen's mind, the clearer it became. He didn't plan to come back to civilization. And he might never let Mira return either. The forests of northern Idaho are vast and relentless, a mixture of shadowy evergreens, steep cliffs, and tangled underbrush that seemed designed to hide secrets. As search teams poured into the Coeur d'Alene and Panhandle region, they faced not just the challenge of locating Kaelen Marlowe, but the unforgiving terrain that allowed him to stay hidden. With years of survival experience and a clear distrust of society, Kaelen had the upper hand. Authorities feared that every hour Mira spent in his presence pushed her deeper into psychological and physical danger. Search crews began working in rotation, setting up makeshift command posts near trailheads and known camping areas. Drones, equipped with thermal imaging, were launched above the tree canopy, while experienced trackers scanned the forest floor for signs of human movement, broken twigs, footprints, disturbed soil. Time and again, they found fleeting traces. A child's handprint on a tree trunk, ash from a fresh campfire, a torn piece of tarp fluttering from a branch. But Kaelen always seemed to be one step ahead. Then came a discovery that changed the course of the investigation. A hunter hiking deep into the woods stumbled upon a makeshift shelter built low to the ground and hidden beneath a thick cluster of branches. It was camouflaged so well that it blended almost seamlessly with the forest. Inside, there were signs of recent activity. Cans of food had been opened with a survival knife. A small fire pit was still warm. On a flattened patch of moss was a child's sweater, pink with a faint pattern of stars. Investigators recognized it from a school photograph of Mira. The area was immediately secured. Officers installed hidden cameras nearby in hopes that Kaelen would return. Days passed in tense silence. Then, in the middle of the third night, a motion-activated camera captured an infrared image of a man approaching the shelter. His figure was gaunt, his posture hunched, and he held something in his arms, possibly a blanket, possibly a child. The image was blurry, but analysts were confident it was Kaelen. Before a tactical team could move in, the shelter was found empty the next morning. He was gone again. But this time, he left behind something more troubling than footprints. A page, torn from a survivalist manual, scorched around the edges, with a single sentence underlined in red ink. Only the pure can survive what is coming. Investigators believed the message was intentional, not just a warning, but a signal of Kaelen's mindset. He didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a protector, taking his daughter away from a world he viewed as corrupt. Further clues emerged in the days that followed. At another campsite, authorities discovered a set of animal bones, carefully cleaned and arranged, suggesting Kaelen was hunting for food. There were drawings scratched into tree bark stick figures, shapes that could represent maps, and crude symbols that investigators had difficulty interpreting. Among the items found was a handmade doll made from pine needles and twine. It was clear Mira had been there. She was still alive, still being moved from place to place. But there was also a new concern. Experts brought in to analyze the campsite noted that the setup had become more erratic. The fire pits were sloppily made, food was left half-eaten, and there were signs of short tempers, cracked tree branches, torn materials, broken tools. Psychologists warned that Kaelen might be deteriorating mentally. Isolation, stress, and paranoia could be driving him to take even more dangerous steps. They feared that as the pressure closed in, Kaelen might make an irreversible decision. The search widened, moving north toward the Canadian border. Flyers with Kaelen and Mira's faces were handed to park rangers, border patrol agents, and local residents. Police urged hikers to avoid venturing alone into the backwoods. Meanwhile, An unspoken fear hung over the entire operation. Every search party understood the stakes. They weren't just trying to capture a fugitive. They were racing against a man who believed he was saving his daughter from the world and might be willing to kill her to complete that mission. Back in Clay Ridge, as search teams continued to sweep the forests of Idaho, a critical piece of the puzzle emerged from a place no one expected, a locked blue box hidden in the attic of Kaelen Marlowe's childhood home. Her sister, Vela Turin, had remembered the strange message Alira had sent weeks before her disappearance. "If something happens, look in the blue box." The cryptic note had haunted her ever since, and now, determined to find meaning in it, she went searching through their late parents' house. Inside the box were journals, folded maps, and a collection of handwritten letters. Most of the contents were addressed to Vela but had never been sent. As detectives read through Alira's journals, a disturbing portrait of her marriage began to form. She had documented years of subtle manipulation, isolation, and psychological control. Kaelen had gradually withdrawn her from her friends and family, convincing her that the world outside was decaying, dangerous, and sick. According to her writings, Kaelen's descent into paranoia had escalated during the pandemic. He became obsessed with the idea that Mira needed to be cleansed of society's influence before it was too late. Alira wrote about Kaelen forcing them to participate in mental resets, periods where they would camp for days in silence, eating only what they could forage, and repeating mantras he believed would prepare them for a coming collapse. She had tried to leave him once 2 years ago, but Kaelen had threatened to take Myra and disappear forever. Fear kept her in place, and now that fear had become reality, the documents also included rough drawings of underground shelters and survival routes Kaelen had mapped years earlier. He had scouted dozens of forest zones across the Pacific Northwest, identifying areas where he could live without being found. One of the maps had a distinct pattern of markings in the Selkirk Mountains, just south of the Canadian border. It showed a path leading to what he had labeled Safe House Red. Authorities hadn't searched that region thoroughly yet, but it immediately became the new focus. Aerial reconnaissance was deployed over the area, and on the third pass, a small clearing was spotted, unnatural and geometric, as though it had been shaped by human hands. Ground teams were dispatched and arrived after a grueling 14-hour hike through rough terrain. What they found was a crude but functional underground shelter, partially buried beneath a collapsed rock formation. It had a trapdoor entrance camouflaged with pine needles and bark dot inside. The air was damp and smelled of mildew. There were sleeping bags, empty cans, and child-sized shoes. But the shelter was empty. It had been abandoned recently. Still, the discovery was vital. Among the discarded items was a tattered notebook with scrawled entries in Kaelen's handwriting. It read more like a manifesto than a journal, filled with rants about false governments, mind poisoning, and the trial of fire Mira needed to pass. One entry stood out. It described a ritual he planned to carry out near the border flame, a phrase investigators didn't immediately understand. But after comparing notes and consulting with local experts, they realized it could refer to an area near the Selkirk Fire Zone, a stretch of wilderness recently scorched in a forest fire. Kaelen's writing suggested he believed fire was symbolic of transformation, and that through it, Mira would be purified. Time was running out. The search effort doubled in manpower, with helicopters moving to the edges of the fire zone and search teams covering every canyon and ravine. They knew Kaelen was becoming desperate, and that desperation could push him to extremes. He was no longer acting with careful planning. His movements were erratic, his trail reckless. And for the first time since the case began, there was real fear that Mira's life was hanging by a thread. The investigators weren't just chasing a man anymore. They were chasing a collapsing mind, spiraling toward a point of no return. Smoke still hung in the air as emergency crews worked through the smoldering remnants of the Selkirk Mountains fire zone. Charred trees stood like blackened skeletons, and ash coated every surface. The heat had passed, but the silence that followed was heavier than flames. A fire containment team hiking through a canyon stumbled upon a burned-out camp, partially protected beneath a rock overhang. Though the area had suffered damage, this space had somehow avoided total destruction. Something about it caught their eye. Among the debris was a metal container, melted slightly on one side, but intact. It was bolted shut and buried under loose dirt and stones. When investigators arrived on scene, they opened the box and found its contents preserved: a scorched notebook, a compass, several handmade maps, and a bundle of folded pages wrapped in cloth. The notebook was Kaelen Marlowe's. Inside, his handwriting had become increasingly frantic and disjointed. He wrote about voices in the trees, signs from the sky, and how Myra had to face the final gate. It was clear his mental state had deteriorated beyond reason. One map showed a specific route through the forest, leading to an isolated ravine marked only with the word "End Place." Teams mobilized immediately and followed the path, climbing over scorched brush and navigating steep terrain. After several hours, they reached a depression in the earth that opened into a makeshift root cellar dug into the hillside. A wooden door, blackened at the edges but still intact, stood ajar. Inside, it was cold, dark, and silent, until they saw a small figure huddled in the corner. Myra Marlowe. She was alive. Weak, frightened, and covered in soot, but alive. A blanket was wrapped around her, and beside her were a few containers of food and a water bottle nearly empty. She didn't speak, only stared at the flashlight beams. With wide, hollow eyes, paramedics rushed her to a nearby field hospital set up for firefighters. Doctors confirmed she had signs of severe malnutrition, minor burns, and emotional trauma, but no life-threatening injuries. Her survival was called a miracle, but the bigger question remained: where was Kaelen? That answer seemed to lie just beyond the ravine. About half a mile from the root cellar, a bloody trail led to the edge of a river. There, tangled in rocks and branches, searchers found a torn piece of Kaelen's shirt and a large hunting knife caked with dried blood. It was unclear whether the blood belonged to him or someone else. Despite multiple days of searching the riverbanks and nearby woods, no body was ever recovered. A cadaver dog alerted near a submerged tree trunk, but divers found nothing beneath the water. The working theory was that Kaelen had attempted to fake his death, using the chaos of the fire and river currents to disappear completely. His familiarity with survival tactics, especially in harsh terrain, meant he could have prepared another hiding place far beyond the reach of the current search grid. But without a body, the case could not be closed. Myra was taken into protective custody, placed with relatives, and underwent extensive psychological evaluation. She spoke little of what happened in the forest. Doctors said she exhibited signs of trauma bonding and confusion between fear and loyalty. She had been taught that the outside world would harm her. It would take time, years, perhaps, for her to recover fully. Kaelen Marlowe's name was added to the FBI's most wanted list. Roadside cameras across the Northwest were monitored. Drone surveillance increased in wilderness zones, and park visitors were urged to report anything suspicious. Several hikers later claimed to have seen a man watching them from a distance in Idaho forests, always alone, always vanishing before anyone could get close. Today, years after the first disappearance, there are still no confirmed sightings of Kaelen, but law enforcement believes he is out there, hidden, patient, and still convinced that the world is too broken to return to. The warning remains active across multiple states. Hikers are told, if you think you see someone in the trees watching silently, don't approach. Walk back the way you came, because the wanted man once known as Kaelen Marlowe may still be waiting in the forest. Asterisk.